Mr. President, we've been debating for quite some time on the Senate floor the Yemen War Powers Resolution introduced by my colleagues Senator Sanders and Senator Lee, which would cut off support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen, support that began under President Obama. Surrounding this vote today, many of my colleagues from both sides of the aisle have expressed frustration, extreme frustration with the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, especially regarding the death of Jamal Khashoggi, an American-based Saudi journalist murdered in Turkey. I have a lot of respect for the senators weighing in, making the arguments all day today. Senators Young, Lee, Corker, Paul, Graham, Murphy, Menendez, Cardin, many. We do need to understand what happened, what our intelligence, our government has surrounding this death. I'm glad the CIA director came to the Hill to brief members. But this debate has taken something of a much more complex turn. Certainly, the heinous murders need to be held accountable. There's no doubt about that. But what we've been discussing and what's really being implicated here on the floor, which hasn't really been talked about too much, is the broader issue of U.S.-American presence in the region, not just regarding the current conflict in Yemen, but also our broader strategic relationship with Saudi Arabia and our national security interests in the region. My colleagues are justified in their frustration. No doubt I share it as well, with the Saudis, with what's happening, but removing American leadership and oversight from this conflict through this resolution is not the way we should go about addressing this. We are trying to execute a policy that both reflects America's values and our national security interests. And that's what's being debated here today. We need to send a strong message to the Saudis, but that message cannot undercut our own national security or those of our allies. The message cannot strengthen what clearly is the biggest threat in the region, and that's Iran, the largest state sponsor of terrorism, which almost nobody on the Senate floor has been talking about over the last several weeks. I intend to. Today's vote has meant different things to different senators, and I've watched and listened to floor speeches, have participated in debates with my colleagues within the Republican conference, when all the senators have met, when we were briefed by administration officials. So I thought I'd try to unpack a little bit of some of these different arguments as I've seen them and provide my views on these. Generally, Mr. President, this debate is focused in three different areas. One, about the constitutional authority, the War Powers Act that we have to actually be undertaking these kind of operations with Saudis in Yemen. The other is limiting and ending U.S. assistance to Saudi operations, U.S. military assistance in Yemen. And finally, there's been some senators who have been focused on downgrading the U.S. relationship with the Saudis because of what's been happening, both in Yemen and with the Khashoggi murder. First, let me talk about the constitutional arguments on the war powers. That the Trump administration needs congressional authority either pursuant to the War Powers Act or, more important, pursuant to Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution to conduct military operations in support of Saudi Arabia's military goals in Yemen. Senator Lee has done a great job of pressing this issue, and he's a senator on many issues that I agree with Senator Lee of Utah on. Clearly one of this body's most knowledgeable and passionate members on safeguarding constitutional prerogatives. But in this case, I simply disagree with him and the other senators whose views I view as way too restrictive on the Commander-in-Chief's ability to utilize our military. If we set the precedent that even an operation such as the refueling of aircraft of allied countries, not even occurring in a war zone, needs congressional authority, either through the War Powers Act or Article 2, we would severely limit the executive branch's ability to direct international crises and safeguard our global national security interests. I believe it would be an unworkable precedent the notion that refueling Allied aircraft constitutes hostilities. It's a stretch of the term. I've also been skeptical of Senate attempts to vote to remove presidential authority on our military operations once those operations have begun. For example, we had a debate on military operations and the authority of our military to operate in Afghanistan, which I believe sends the wrong message to our troops. It's a precedent that once hostilities begin, we don't have your back of our forces, and I think that is also a dangerous precedent. This is not to say that this is not an important debate. It's certainly an important debate. Other members, Senator Kaine, have come down here and talked a lot about the importance of this issue, military authority. But, Mr. President, with regard to this discussion, I think it's too limiting. Let me talk about the second major issue involved that most senators have been focused on, whether to vote to affirmatively end U.S. military assistance to Saudi Arabia in their actions in Yemen, and whether and how, in doing so, will either help end the humanitarian disaster going on there. For months, I want to compliment Senator Young, Senator Murphy. They've been making the case passionately on this topic with much expertise. Clearly, they and this body have been focused on two goals. We all want a peaceful resolution of the conflict in Yemen, and we all want an end to the humanitarian disaster in Yemen. The reason, Mr. President, that I voted against the resolution today is that I do not believe that either of these goals will be made easier or advanced by less American involvement in the conflict. To the contrary, if the U.S. no longer has the ability to help guide the Saudis militarily in Yemen, I believe that these two important goals, ending the humanitarian crisis, bringing a peaceful resolution, will actually be harder to reach. And that's not just my view. That was the view of Secretary Mattis, Secretary Pompeo, when they came to brief all 100 senators 2 weeks ago. And these are someone, in particular Secretary Mattis, who knows the region and certainly knows about how hostilities end and begin in the region. The basis of their arguments, which I agree, was first, there's no doubt that the Saudis have prosecuted the war badly. But both the Obama Department of Defense and the Trump administration Department of Defense have worked hard to minimize casualties. Does anyone actually believe that the situation in Yemen will improve without U.S. assistance and guidance? The question almost answers itself. Having our military involved has helped the Saudis improve their coordination, improve their targeting to minimize the civilian casualties. Having our military involved has helped the Saudis manage disagreements between them and their Gulf coalition partners. These partners also play an important role in helping to bring an end to this war. Having our military involved has also helped provide critical leverage as we move into the hopeful peace negotiations underway right now as we speak in Sweden. Yemen's government and the Houthi rebels have evidently agreed to a prisoner swap that could include thousands of prisoners and could be the beginning of a diplomatic breakthrough. I had the opportunity to talk with Secretary Mattis and Pompeo this weekend. Both said this would be exactly the wrong time at a key diplomatic moment to have the U.S. limit and end its military assistance to Saudi Arabia. Now, Mr. President, I know sometimes people don't like to think this way, but military strength and leverage is often critical to successful diplomatic negotiations. And for the first time, there is promise in negotiations in Sweden. All of us want that to succeed. However, I believe we undermine our chances of success in these diplomatic efforts if Congress forces the U.S. to end military assistance to the Saudis. We also have an even more direct and real national security interest in the region. Yemen is an important front in the war on terror. It is the home to al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP. They have attempted multiple times to directly attack our homeland and were responsible for the attack on the USS Cole that killed 17 U.S. sailors and severely wounded 39 others. And they were responsible for the 2015 massacre at Charlie Hebdo's offices in Paris. Limiting our military involvement in Yemen could pose significant risks with regard to AQAP that I believe would be unacceptable for the American people. Mr. President, the third line of argument that we've seen on the floor, and many have been discussing, goes much broader than just the relationship between our military involvement in Yemen. And it really implicates the entire U.S.-Saudi strategic relationship. And it is a desire of a number of my colleagues to use this debate and the despicable Khashoggi murder as an opportunity to fully downgrade this decades-old strategic relationship. The Saudis are difficult partners, no doubt. They have been for decades. Last week when I was presiding, Senator Rubio gave an excellent speech saying that he believed the Saudis are testing the limits of their relationship with the U.S. and that we should look to draw some hard lines and recalibrate elements of our relationship while demanding improvements in other areas. I agreed with much of Senator Rubio's speech, including his conclusion, like mine, that we should not be cutting off our military assistance to the Saudis in Yemen because it would do much more harm than good. Nevertheless, some senators have argued for a much more downgrading of the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia. In fact, so much of this has been exclusively focused on the Saudis, with no other reference to any other country in the Middle East, that it seems this debate on the floor has been in a vacuum. But as we know, Mr. President, there are a lot more countries in the region, including the world's biggest sponsor of state terrorism, Iran, which nobody's talking about, but we should be talking about them. Because, in fact, the war in Yemen began when Tehran-backed Houthi rebels seized power in 2015. Again, not a lot of discussion of how it began. Tehran is trying to establish a Hezbollah-like entity on the Arabian Peninsula in Yemen, including with the increased capabilities to target cities in Saudi Arabia with ballistic missiles supplied by Iran. This is all part of Iran's broader strategy in the region to encircle our traditional allies, whether Saudi Arabia, Gulf Arab states, and, of course, Israel, with proxy fighters throughout Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and close relationships in Iraq. And yet, Mr. President, no one in this debate seems to want to talk about Iran. So I thought I'd do so for a minute. Let's talk about the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. U.S. aid has totaled humanitarian aid almost $697 million in the past 14 months. Saudi Arabia, yes, they can do a much better job, but they've invested well over $1 billion to try and end the suffering. Iran, the country that started the war, the country that nobody on the Senate floor is talking about, not a dime to relieve the suffering. Sure, they've supplied weapons and ballistic missiles in the millions, tens of millions of dollars, but nothing to relieve the suffering. The U.S. military, if we cut off U.S. military assistance to Riyadh in Yemen, you better believe the one capital in the Middle East that will be cheering the loudest is in Iran, in Tehran. Again, the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism. Such an action would further embolden Iran and no doubt embolden its proxies, while at the same time, our allies including Israel, would feel less secure. So, Mr. President, as this debate has carried on the Senate with no one talking about the largest state sponsor of terrorism, I've found it very, very troubling, because the lens through which we need to view security in the Middle East is through Iran. Although we have this dissatisfaction and frustration with some of our allies, we must remember that the most significant and serious threat in the Middle East continues to be Iran. There's been a lot of focus on the horrible death of Mr. Khashoggi. Any death is horrible. But, Mr. President, let me talk about some other deaths. In the Middle East, in Iraq, we had over 500 American military members killed and almost 2,000 wounded by the improvised explosive devices supplied to Iraqi Shia militias by the Iranians. Let me say that again. 2,000 Americans killed and wounded by the largest state sponsor of terrorism, and yet nobody seems to talk about that. Yes, one death of a journalist, American-born journalist, horrible. 2,000 American dead and wounded is really horrible. Where was the outrage about those deaths? Where was the outrage about those murders? Where were the editorials about those murders of American citizens? Well, the previous administration wasn't focused on those because they were focused on the Iran nuclear deal. So, Mr. President, all I'm saying is in this debate, when nobody's talking about the real enemy of the United States, it's the Iranians who are watching this debate and smiling because no one's talking about them. So I thought it was important to come down and say, some of us are. Some of us know that you're behind the war in Yemen. Some of us know that you continually say you want to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. Some of us know that the Iran deal only emboldened you. And what we need to keep in mind is, yes, we have difficult partners. No doubt the Saudis are difficult. They're not perfect by any sense of the word. But this is a difficult region, and these are difficult issues. And if we think we can debate Yemen and our help there without talking about the Saudis and the Iranians who started the war and are trying to encircle our different allies, including Israel, and think somehow that this debate is not emboldening them more, I think we're misguided. So, Mr. President, I voted against this resolution because I still think it's important to keep in mind the lens through which we need to assess our security interests and those of our allies in the Middle East is through what helps or undermines Iran. And I am concerned that this resolution can help them. And that's not good for the United States. It's not good for the war in Yemen. It's not good for the humanitarian catastrophe in Yemen. And it's certainly not good for our allies like Israel. I yield the floor.